As a parent, how would you respond when told that your young son had severe hearing loss, along with other symptoms, eliminating his quality of life? Jeff Seitzer, as an older parent, became immobilized with fear, which I think is the reaction that many of us would have. He did not know if he would be able to be present because of things that were going on in his own life to help his son with his neurological problems. Jeff had to rise to the challenge, and that's what this show is always all about, never giving up hope. Jeff rose to the challenge, and he is going to show us how to do the same thing when we are confronted with insurmountable odds.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Today on Never Ever Give Up Hope, I have Jeff Seitzer. I have read his story more than once because it is a compelling story. It goes to so many different things: stamina, tenacity, overcoming extreme hurdles, all the lessons that are learned through the loss of a child, and on and on. So I am so excited to have you here today, Jeff.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
All right. Well, we are going to get right into your story. I know that you had encephalitis at the age of 4 and a near fatal accident at 10 years old. So run with it and share your story.
Yes, when I was 4 years old, I had a really bad case of mumps, and I recall being home from school one day, and I was kind of bored because television was so boring then, and so I saw a commercial on TV where Boy Scouts put a little teepee, built a teepee fire and cooked some fish on it. So I went out in the yard and got a bunch of sticks and built a teepee on the gas stove and started a fire to cook bologna, right? And so I burned the kitchen down and almost died in the fire. My
Oh
mom pulled
my
me out,
word.
and I remember the fireman talking to me through the door because I didn't want to catch mumps, instructing me about fire safety, etc. And I mentioned this because shortly after that, I got encephalitis. The case of mumps was so bad.
Oh
And it kind of
dear.
started me on a certain trajectory because, for much of my life, I felt kind of unlucky. All sorts of things were kind of happening to
Hmm.
me. And, and later in life, after our son was born, I had a number of experiences that helped me reverse that. But let me say a few things about some of these early childhood things, because the encephalitis really upended my family. It was very difficult. I had all sorts of severe symptoms, like I had paralysis and slurred speech, and I had these wild mood swings. When I was in high school, I met someone who said, "I remember you from the neighborhood because we would see you and your grandparents and neighbors, or your grandparents and your parents and neighbors chasing after you across the neighborhood." Because I would just suddenly hop up and run out of the house and tear off, because my kind of brain waves would suddenly go haywire. So it was really hard on my family in that sense, but it was also super hard in that I went away to Chicago for the better part of a couple of years. I grew up in Nebraska, and I spent all this time with my mom and sometimes my grandparents in Chicago getting treatment, which was super hard on my other siblings. My little brother came much later, and he tragically died a couple years ago, rather young. And at his funeral, my older brother and sister got up and gave entirely different takes on the family. They said, my older brother said, before he came along, my younger brother Chris, the family was very disciplined and they lost all their discipline. And my sister got up and said, before my little brother Chris came, my parents were terrible parents, and afterwards they became good parents. And I was stunned by this because I had a completely different take. But the fact is, for each one of us, we grow up in a different family, partly because of encephalitis, right? So they kind of grew up in a family where my parents were gone a lot and that I got a lot of attention. Uh, but for me, of course, now I look back on this and I remember it entirely differently because I had the time of my life with encephalitis. I don't remember the terrible symptoms and any suffering from that. What I remember is going off to Chicago and having this really exciting life and not being kind of, a working stiff kid. Most kids are kind of like in this regimentation where they go to preschool and they go
Hmm.
to swim lessons, etc. And I was like riding the train to Chicago and living in this really cool neighborhood, Lincoln Park, which is a super shishy neighborhood now, but back then it was very bohemian, and the alleys were all brick, and people just loved me. Like I'd go into the hospital, and the doctors and nurses were so nice to me. And this was kind of unusual then because as a kid, then you were mostly invisible. You would come
Right,
into people's radar screen when
right.
you were being bad and you were being yelled at. But for me, I got all this great attention. Now, the thing is, when I came back to Nebraska, it was like such a rude awakening. I was just shocked. For one thing, I didn't know how things worked. I had not been kind of, socialized in an ordinary kid world. And so I'd watch people kind of like, how do they know how all this works? And one thing that was kind of a side benefit of this that I only realize now is that I saw that the world was plastic, right? That what people thought was the normal way of doing things wasn't necessarily
Hmm.
the way it had to be, right? And I also became very observant because I was kind of an outsider. I had to observe how things were done
Hmm.
and figure out how to kind of relate to them. And on top of that, I had all of these residual effects from encephalitis. Like I had extreme nervous energy. I just shook all the time. It was really hard for me to concentrate in school. And, back then you didn't have accommodations. They didn't talk about ADHD. You were just told like sit still,
Right,
you know,
exactly.
so it was very difficult. So I had to kind of adapt in a lot of ways with all of these symptoms. Now, at the time, for example, I did adapt and got great friends, etc. And then about age 10, I had this near fatal accident where we were chasing each other around this house and the parents weren't there, which could only happen back then. Back
Right.
then where your parents were gone and you would just be having the run of the place at 10 years old. And I was chasing this friend of mine and he closed a door in front of him and it was a had plate glass windows in it. And I put my arm right through it and pulled it back. And I was just bleeding to
Oh,
death.
wow.
Both my veins and arteries were severed and my nerves and tendons were severed. And at the time, I thought to myself, I did survive because there happened to be a student nurse living in the house, and normally she was gone all day, but she came back to get a notebook and found me there bleeding to death in the bathroom.
Oh
And
my
so she wrapped
goodness.
me up and took me to the hospital and saved my life. Now, the irony is that I look back on that and I think I thought at the time, God, I just have such terrible luck. First, I had encephalitis, and then have this near fatal accident. But of course, at the same time, you could see me as lucky. Someone was there and they saved my life.
Hmm.
And there happened to be
Hmm.
a pediatric neurosurgeon in Omaha giving a lecture. Because at the time, if you had this sort of injury, your hand would just be immobile. But he tried a new procedure on me, and my hand is completely great. And this is kind of like a
Wow.
theme of my life in a way that I've had all sorts of setbacks in my life, which are pretty bad, but they always bring new skills and outlooks, right? And then I'm actually pretty lucky because of it. It took me a long time to realize this, um, but it did finally sink in. Now a little bit later, when I was about 13, after finally kind of figuring things out and adjusting fairly well, I was diagnosed with this condition called Charcot-Marie tooth disease.
Hmm.
Now, this is a neurological condition where your arms and legs degenerate, which was discovered by three French guys named Charcot-Marie tooth disease, but it's often thought to be a dental disease. Like later after
Huh.
college, I was slated to go into the Peace Corps and teach English in West Africa. And the Peace Corps, right before I was ready to leave, saw that I had Charcot-Marie tooth disease, and they said, "Well, we can't send you because we don't have dental facilities in
Hmm.
the area." Right? Couldn't convince them that I was a condition that affected my feet. Now, the thing is, at the time, my mom had this condition, and her condition
Really?
was very bad. It's hereditary in my form, and my grandfather had it, and he was very hobbled. So they did what they thought was right. They had me see an orthopedic guy, and they put me in leg braces.
Hmm.
Now, this had a huge impact on my self-image. It was junior high, which
Mhm,
is like
mhm.
the worst idea ever anyone ever came up with was junior high. And it was like, so I was so self-conscious and I became kind of withdrawn. I was popular before, so I got bullied a little bit. I had to find all new friends and kind of fend off bullies and other things like that. And so it was really kind of affected my self-image for quite a while. Um, but and there's so many twists and turns with this condition. For example, I got out of the leg braces. Ironically, because I had to go buy special shoes for them. And the 20-year-old shoe salesman said, "Hey, you could probably get these plastic braces. You don't have to
Hmm.
wear these things." I was like, "What? Why did I learn this from a shoe salesman? What about my doctors?" So then I had plastic leg braces until I was about 27. And the irony is that I handled the hyperactivity from encephalitis through extreme physical activity. And then when I was diagnosed with CMT, I became very disciplined about physical
Hmm.
activity. And the great thing about this, as people know now, it's a great way to handle depression, right? And
Really?
anxiety. Like I had all this anxiety from encephalitis too. I was really jittery and like I was kind of like really nervous and worried about things. And the physical activity helped limit that.
Hmm.
But the irony is, my legs got so strong from working out so much that the plastic braces shattered, and I had to go get a prescription. Right, I had to get a prescription for new ones, and the doctor at the University of Chicago, where I was a graduate student, said, "You know, you may have a very mild case, but you certainly shouldn't be wearing braces." And
Oh
he
my
thought I might not
goodness.
even have the condition at all. And I just exploded. I mean, this poor guy, he kind of backed away from me because I was like, "You mean I never should have been in braces?" Because it was like half my life had been in
Yes,
physical
yes.
and emotional torment. Right. Now, later, 15 years later, after our son was born, he was a little bit he was a little bit wobbly at a certain early point in his life, and we thought it was because he'd had some pneumonias and maybe just didn't have sea legs. But I went and got a new blood test and learned that I did have the condition, and it was a severe form. And I went to a special clinic, and I learned so much about the condition for the first time. So many things. For example, the doctor thinks that my CMT, the particular form, might have caused the encephalitis. And he said there's only
Wow.
about 10 known cases of this, right? Uh, so again, I'm thinking to myself, how unlucky is that? Like I have this degenerative condition and it
Mhm.
causes encephalitis that really kind of upended my life in a lot of ways and made my life really difficult. But later you look back on it and you realize actually I was developing all of these great life skills
Mhm.
because when our son was born, I wasn't a mean person, but, I was and I had a kind of a caring side, but I was so caught up in my self-care regimen
Right.
from encephalitis and CMT that I didn't think I had no time for anyone else, right?
Mm.
I had to exercise a huge amount, and I would have to you can do a lot of mental stimulation through studying, etc. And I just felt like I couldn't fit in care for anyone else. And but then our son unexpectedly was born with all of these internal organ defects, and they were very serious. Like his trachea was his esophagus was attached to his trachea,
Oh,
so
wow.
stomach acid was flowing into his lungs, and he was going to, if they untreated, he would just die. And he also had a bunch of heart defects, which were very serious. Like his aorta was almost fused shut, so they had to do this harrowing
Wow.
22-hour surgery where they shut the flow of blood off to his brain for quite a while in order to widen it. So here we are, completely taken by surprise by this. And my wife, who'd always been kind of the responsible adult, she'd always kind of like researched things and took care of things, and while I went and kind of just cared for myself, she stayed back at the maternity hospital because she's so worn out from a long labor and put me in charge. And I thought, what? You're putting me in charge? Because I wouldn't quite listen to people. I'd expect her to listen and take notes and respond effectively. But here the doctors are talking to me about really serious things. I have to listen very closely. And I also thought to myself, what is going to happen to my life? But then I had this extraordinary experience with him in the hospital where he was having this test and he was really agitated and they couldn't continue the test. And before they did the test, I just been he held my one of my fingers in his tiny little hand and I rubbed the back of his neck and I talked to him about this this idea in German philosophy because I taught German philosophy. I know. Well, when you're really nervous, you can't think of anything else. So I'm just kind of blabbing on. But then when I left to go to the bathroom, he became very agitated. When I came back, I resumed what I was doing before, and he got very calm. And I was just kind of
Hmm.
astonished. And I felt like it's a kind of as odd as it sounds. I felt like he was asking me to take care of him.
Hmm.
And of course, I thought to myself, my God, what a terrible personnel decision, right? Because I was just so used to taking care of myself.
Hmm.
I was kind of a special needs adult myself. How could I take care of a fragile little baby? But nonetheless, I gave up, my teaching career and I stayed home with him. And it was like a huge spirit challenge for me. Because I really had to think of his needs and put his needs before my own. And I had to learn to live entirely differently. But it helped me realize that all of these other things I'd experienced in my life before that I had been kind of bitter about, they actually helped me be the ideal caregiver for him because I had
Amazing.
learned during that time how to like manage all of these symptoms while living a full life. I like did great, and I got a PhD from the University of Chicago. I stayed really fit. I had a great social life. All while I was dealing with all these other symptoms. And so I took that spirit and I applied it to his life, right, and started to live more for him than myself. And it really turned out well because we had a great time together. He had this great sense of fun despite all of his health challenges. And we just went out into the world and just really enjoyed ourselves while, I took care of all of his symptoms and helped him kind of thrive. So it was really kind of a wonderful partnership and kind of put me on an entirely new track. And by age 10, but it was short of his 10th birthday, he was thriving and doing really well. And then on a family vacation, we were swimming in Lake Michigan and we were swept into an area of extreme turbulence
Oh no.
and he drowned. And I drowned with him. I was underwater for several minutes and somehow miraculously survived. My arms and legs were blue, which means I don't know, I had a huge
Hmm.
oxygen deprivation. And yet somehow I survived. And my closing thought before, I passed out, I just blacked out as we were sinking, was I won't be able to tell his story.
Oh
And
my
then
word.
I survived. And I thought to myself, well, I guess that's why I wrote a memoir about our time together, because I felt I was duty bound. But it turned out to be a really great exercise for me because it helped me crystallize what I learned from him. And I came to realize that every single event in your life and every person, both good and bad, has something to teach you. And so it was really wonderful to crystallize it in that way because lots of times you look back at your life or events and you think you kind of have a handle on what they are, but it's just really, you really haven't gotten to the heart of it. And so it was really wonderful to not only understand what he taught me, but help me go back and see how lucky I was during my life, really. I mean, I only had 10 years with him, but I was really lucky to have those 10 years.
Exactly.
A- And it really changed me. And it doesn't
Yes.
mean that after he died, there was just like all, skipping down the yellow brick road, uh, but I was kind of, set again on another track and I became deeper and more spiritual after that. And I kind of grateful for it.
What an amazing story. Wow. I am excited that your attitude is one where even though you were very self absorbed, and I appreciate that
Yeah.
you shared that because I also know that this is part of what you had to relearn and how
Hmm.
to care for others, which you touched on a little bit. And we're going to talk, of course, more about that because that your life has changed now, obviously.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we are going to take a short break, and when we come back, we want to talk about two things. First of all, we want to talk about how we learn and grow through pain because you definitely have set the platform as someone who can address that. The second thing is we're going to talk about your book, and I love the title. I just think this it's so intriguing, and it is The Fun Master: A Father's Journey of Love, Loss, and Learning to Live One Day at a Time. So we will be right back.
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another. Gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
It has been an incredible experience listening to Jeff's story today as he shares not only all the physical, emotional, and mental problems that he had to overcome within his own growing up years, but also what happened after he had his son and the heart-wrenching that he went through regarding this little creature that he was now responsible for and had to make decisions for, and then at 10 years old, he lost him. So, yes, the emotions are running high here, Jeff, as you have shared your story. And I really appreciate how you have put it together so beautifully. So now let's continue and talk to us about what you have learned through this time of pain, through this time of suffering, and not only what you've learned for yourself, but to help others. And then, of course, your book.
There's so many things I've learned through my life. Like I'd mentioned with encephalitis, I had to adjust quite a bit. And one thing is I became very observant of how things work. And this was really helpful for me when I became a parent because just as I felt like a little bit of an outsider returning to kid life after encephalitis, I was also pretty much an outsider when I took over Ethan's care. Um, First of all, I was a guy. I mean, now many men are home with children, and which is a good thing. I mean, it's a really good thing after the pandemic that more men started taking care of children, and people had more time with their families,
Mhm.
at least a certain social segment. But at the time, I was like the only guy in a sea of women. Which separated me a little bit. One thing I had to learn was I had to up my emotional IQ, right? Because I started out thinking, well, I'm just pretty much a colleague, and my role is to kind of, set up play dates, etc. And I had to learn how to do that in a way that didn't make the moms nervous and their spouses,
Oh, of course.
because
Yeah.
oftentimes, yeah, like sometimes we'd be invited over and we'd have this nice time, and then we'd set up another time to get together again, and then you'd see the moms, and they'd be really kind of nervous and talk to they'd talk to Ethan and say to him, well, maybe you can come over, when so and so's dad is home, or maybe when your mom is
Hmm.
there. And so they're really kind of nervous about me being around. So I had to kind of learn how to move through this field of uneasiness and make myself, not threatening while being very helpful at the same time, which is requires a good deal of self-effacing, really, which is kind of hard for a guy. You have to be very you humble. Helps you learn humility. And then we were also a little bit of outsiders because Ethan had some health challenges. Like his airways were kind of papery, and he would have a cold and get over it very quickly. But it took him a very long time. He would have this barky cough, which could really clear a room. And so that made it hard to go to the usual kid sort of things for a while. So we would just kind of explore the neighborhood. We got to know all the people in the neighborhood. Like our neighborhood is full of auto repair places, which a lot of the neighbors would complain about. We're tired of all these auto repair places. They were a godsend for us because these grizzled, seemingly hard-edged guys would invite us in. They were so sweet with him. Come on in, and they'd show him. They'd hoist the cars up on
Aw,
the racks, and it was such a wonderful experience. They were kind of my heroes in a way because we would spend a lot of time going to these various places. And so, I was observant. I had to be observant and really adaptable. And I learned this through my life, from after
of
encephalitis and
course.
after
Yes.
CMT, because you have to kind of go through the world a little bit differently. And and learning this helped me, build stronger relationships with people, but also, with him in particular. I had to really. He was someone who was kind of like, he was a little bit of a tough nut in terms of not complaining. It was kind of hard to figure out what was really affecting him. And so I had to develop my up my emotional IQ there as well, to discern, smaller signals, and think more deeply about, how things might be affecting him. And it was really uh, quite a lesson for me. But one of the big things I learned from him, he had kind of an instinct for connecting with people. And what he would do is he would observe them and see the one thing that they might have in common. And he would overlook all the other aspects of someone's character and their past behavior, for example. And
Interesting. Hmm.
he'd be, oh, I'm sorry. He would open himself to them and really focus on that one thing that they could develop an enthusiastic connection about. And it was kind of an extraordinary thing to watch. And I
Hmm.
realized that I go through the world entirely differently. If I had a bad experience with someone, I would be hyper vigilant about it, and I would try and limit their impact on my life, and perhaps close myself off to them. And he helped me see that I could really change that
Wow.
outlook and start looking for things in people, the one thing that you can kind of develop an enthusiastic connection with. And it really works if you're willing to do it. But it takes a lot of courage to do that, because it's natural to feel a little bit of resentment toward people. And human beings have this defensive instinct. Negative experiences, I teach philosophy of happiness, among other things, and you learn that the brain is hardwired to focus on these negative
Hmm.
experiences because
Definitely.
it's a survival technique,
Right.
right? And he looked past that. It was almost an
Hmm.
instinct in his case. But I realized that, if I worked at it, maybe it could become more of an instinct for myself. It would take a lot more effort. Um, but these are some of the lessons that I learned in my time with him.
How
Um,
did you cope with his death?
oh, well,
Was guilt a major part of it?
Well, I did feel responsible for his death. I mean, both my wife and I did, because we were very careful parents. We weren't helicopter parents, but we were really careful about his safety. And that day we were off our game. We weren't going to go swimming, and friends arrived and they wanted to go swimming. And, Ethan begged on bended knee to go swimming. I wasn't there at the time. So then I arrived. I was at the store picking stuff up, and, I arrive and everybody goes into the water, and he goes into the water. And so I kind of, reluctantly went in him with him. We didn't have time to really talk about safety. And there we were in the water and swept into this area of extreme turbulence. And there were people all around us who were fine. I mean, it was kind of like,
Really?
yeah, it
Wow.
felt a little personal. I actually ended the book, the first draft of the book ended with a Neo Greek tragedy, because I
Okay.
felt it was kind of like that. But nonetheless, we were, responsible for him going swimming that day, and I was with him. And for 3 weeks after he died, I had taken a
Mm.
bunch of notes during our time, because my mother-in-law encouraged me to keep a journal, because she thought the stories were great, and one day I would maybe publish some of them. And I decided against it, because he didn't like to be the center of attention. He said to me
Hmm.
once, some people need to be the main character, but not me. Right. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to
Aw.
write a book about him. But I took notes anyway, because it was kind of nice to remember things. And it gave me something to do at the
Hmm.
playground when
Right.
all the moms weren't making eye contact. I could just write in my notebook. But nonetheless, I had all these notes. But after he died, I could not pull up one memory of our time together,
Wow.
uh, other than being under the water with him. And that went on for like 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, it was like the telltale heart was beating,
Hmm.
because people were comforting me, saying, you did everything you could to try and save him. It's not your fault. And yet I was hearing the telltale heart. I wanted to scream, "Don't you
Yeah.
know I killed him?" I thought
Yeah.
that maybe
Yeah.
I'd sacrificed him to save myself, because how else did I survive? A brave man, who had lost a child himself 2 years before, and he had took care of her to a great extent. She had cerebral palsy, and they were very close. And he had been very devastated by her passing. This was the first time that he'd been at the beach after she died. They had a house nearby, and there he is, taking in the beautiful scene, the sun and the waves, and thanking God for this beautiful day. And he sees us in trouble, and everyone else on the beach thought we were just playing, which is, I don't blame them. This is often the
Hmm.
case.
Hmm.
I've learned about drownings quite a bit. I work on water safety now, and oftentimes people look as though they're fine, and then they disappear. But he didn't think so, and he tried to find like a life ring or something, and there wasn't one. So he grabbed a boogie board, and that blew away when he got in the water. And this is a momentous thing because many bystanders die themselves who go out try to rescue someone,
Really?
die
Wow.
themselves. And so he's at great risk. He swam out and he took Ethan and tried to swim back, but he was taking on water and drowning himself, and all three of us went under together. Um, he found his way to the surface and got back to the shore and coughed up a bunch of water and asked the people on the beach if they'd seen either of us, and they said no. And finally, I emerged, several minutes later. So I've been underwater for a long time. But here's the interesting thing. I don't remember him at all.
Really?
I
Wow.
do not. No, to this day, I don't remember him coming out there. And the thing is, I think that I was already so far gone that
Hmm.
that's why I don't remember him. But really, what is really important about his story is that his people in his prayer group told him, you shouldn't go to the wake. It would be inappropriate for you to go to the wake. But if he hadn't, um, Ethan's godmother, who kind of pulled his body from the water, she made contact with him on the beach and got in touch with him, because if I hadn't gotten to know him, I
Hmm.
probably would have committed suicide,
Wow.
because I would have. How could I have lived with myself without
Yeah.
knowing his part of the story? Because he convinced me, and I believe this is sincere. I didn't sacrifice him to save myself. It's miraculous that I survived, but I went
Exactly.
down with him. We were sinking, and that was it. And so it's kind of almost. I felt like I was divine intervention saved me. Um, but I can't swear to that, but it feels that way to a
Now,
degree.
this was Lake Michigan, you said,
Lake
right?
Michigan, yes.
And is that normal, like these kind of turbulences?
Well, the Great Lakes are very dangerous, in contrast to the ocean. I mean, of course, the ocean, the waves are much larger, but in the Great Lakes, the waves are smaller, but they come in rapid succession. And also,
Okay.
different forms of tides are working in the Great Lakes. Like Lake Michigan is unusual in that it's very long, and it's almost like a rectangle, really, and it's very narrow. So wind comes from one direction or the other and pushes the waves across the lake at an angle, so they hit the shore and bounce back at an odd angle, which produces these
Oh,
very dangerous
yes.
currents. And we were swimming at the very southern edge of Lake Michigan, where um, this sort of thing happens with greater frequency and ferocity. And so it does occur, but there's a kind of a certain ignorance about the Great Lakes and how dangerous they can be. And so there's a huge number of drowning. Lake Michigan is considered the most dangerous of the Great Lakes. Now, my wife and I, she grew up on Lake Michigan, and I've spent, like, together we've had over 100 years on Lake Michigan. So we feel like not completely informed about it, uh, which is kind of like, people could say, well, what sort of idiots are you? And that's kind of the way we feel. But there's now an effort to. I worked on a bill to helped with some legislation to have water safety in the schools of
Oh
Illinois,
my
which is a great
goodness.
idea.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
because think how dangerous it is, and people
Yep.
just go in there. And the fact is, it's like a siren call. The waves are coming in. It's so beautiful. I mean, even today, it's hard to resist going in. And but once you're aware, you can be more careful. Like, I had a friend who, this brave woman, almost single-handedly, got life rings placed upon the Chicago beaches, which was a huge achievement.
Huh.
Because people bystanders face this terrible choice: do I go in and try and save this person, or do I
Right.
and risk my own life,
Right.
right? Or do I stand by helplessly and watch someone drown? She ended up watching someone drown, and for her, she thought, I can't make other people face this choice. So she got the life rings put on the Chicago beaches, and she looked
Wow.
back at it.
Great.
Yeah, I know. What an amazing person, because I have been immobilized. Ethan died 12 years ago, and it took me almost 10 years to start working on water safety because it was just so traumatic, to even think about it. But she had this video she showed me, taken right before this drowning occurred, and she saw a gap in the waves. And that indicated that there might be a rip current there. And it was very
Oh,
close to a pier, which is like extremely dangerous. They have structural currents along piers. You know, right before Penelope started high school, she's on the rowing team now. A guy who was on the rowing team a year before drowned by a pier near our house. He was an expert swimmer, and he jumped in the water, and there was a structural current there, so there weren't any life rings. So he drowned, you know. And so these sorts of things people need to be aware of, and there's more, efforts to raise
of course.
awareness. But still, there's a lot that needs to be done, I think. But I felt, to get back to your original point, like I felt responsible. And so after meeting him, the memories came flooding back. Taking care of Ethan changed my life, and taking care of you and Penelope will save my life. So you tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it. So she said, I want to go back to the beach and say some prayers. And I said, okay. I was like, what? You know, that's the last place I wanted to be, because I had felt I'd never left the beach. You know, my
Mm,
mind, the drowning was playing in my head like on a continuous feedback loop. But after we did that, you know, it created an opening. Like we both turned away from anger, because we only had ourselves to blame, right? We couldn't blame other people. I mean, you could say, well, why weren't there lifeguards there? And why wasn't there more police protection? I mean, you could find things to blame people for, but the fact is we made that decision that day, and it was a terrible one. And it's rarely the case that parents are punished so badly for a
right, of
misstep.
course.
But, giving up the anger, we threw ourselves into the grief and shared our grief with other people. And the kind of healing thing about that, which was so interesting, is that and this is really great for your podcast, because you know this very well. People come kind of out of the woodwork and share their stories.
Yes, of
They've
course.
been suffering in silence, right? And trying to adapt to other people, because they're putting on a front for other people. They're pretending they're okay because people kind of expect this, and they don't want to voice their suffering onto other people. But they know you are suffering too. So they come and share that with you. And it's really kind of eye-opening. You're like, my God, there's like a huge secret society of sufferers out there.
Exactly. I've noticed
And
that for sure. Yes,
yeah,
definitely.
and so you bond with these people, and it's kind of like a huge support network where you can be yourself around them. They aren't upset that you break down. They don't expect you to be
Hmm.
completely together. And that really helped a lot. So we threw ourselves into, helping other people who are grieving, and, sharing our grief. And it was, I don't know. I hesitate to use the word healing, because it sounds like, a scab forms, then it heals, and it's all gone, because it's never quite gone. You're kind of disabled to a degree. Like, I don't feel fully present in my life, because this always kind of is on my mind. I was the town crier. I would just be sobbing, in public. Suddenly I'd be overcome, and I just couldn't help it. I experience the world emotionally. Whereas my wife is not a less caring person. She's a very caring person, but she experiences the world more emotionally. So she threw herself into reading. So it helped us get through it. And we also, of course, had our daughter Penelope. And, this was, of course, I mean, talk about a change in her field, because she came as an orphan at 18 months old, when kids are that stranger danger time. She'd been, part of time in an orphanage, and then 4 foster families. So a lot of changes in her life. And she came here, and Ethan was so instrumental in her adjusting, because he loved her so much, and he was so much fun. In fact, the title of the book, The Fun Master, is what his friends called him, because he had this instinct for making every situation,
Oh,
more fun.
right.
Like,
That's
he,
where that came from.
yeah, and so he was an alpha male sort of guy who'd come in, "Come on, everyone, this is what we're doing." He'd come in and see, is this working productively? If it was, he'd go with it, or he'd add an idea and start another thing, and it always made things more fun. And so he had a lot of friends that were really great, and they welcomed her into their little society. And so for her, those 2 years were ideal. She had the platonic form of an older brother, and then suddenly, one day on a family vacation, he's gone. And she got zombie parents, parents who weren't fully there.
Right,
But
of course.
she,
Yes.
this little this little hellion, like she turned to my wife Janet one day. Janet was crying, and her mom was there, and her mom said to Penelope, "Yeah, your mom's just a little sad." And Penelope said, "Yeah, mom." Oh no, Penelope said to Grandma, "Mommy's crying because Ethan died, but I'm still here." And
What an
it,
observation. Wow.
yes, and
Yes,
she was
excellent.
right. We kind of threw ourselves into providing her the best childhood she could have, and that was
Right.
kind of great
Exactly.
too. But it was really hard.
No
You're
kidding. And
yeah,
this is now your book, The Fun
yeah.
Master, The Father's Journey of Love, Loss, and Learning to Live, one day at a time. Who should buy this book?
Well, there's several really audiences that would really appreciate this book. One is, of course, parents of kids with special needs. Definitely, because he had a
Okay,
number of special needs that he had
right.
to work through, and kind of a wide range of them. Some people might be interested in because of neurological problems that I had, which is another kind of special need group. I
Hmm.
also think it speaks to people more generally because kind of the theme of the book is that life. I'm not presented as a hero dad. I'm just kind of a regular guy trying to do my best to take care of my kid, and I think most parents could relate to that, and even most people, because the fact is, life gives everyone a little bit more than they can handle, and and part of the theme is that if someone as flawed as me can rise to the occasion, and help manage his life and still have fun, then others can too. But the final group, of course, are those who are grieving. It's not a grief book because the like 90% of the book is Ethan's my relationship together.
That's what I was
Um,
wondering. Okay, that's
yeah,
what the
but it
okay,
begins with his death and it ends with the aftermath, and it ends on a high
okay.
note after his death. So those groups I think would be particularly interested in it, and it's also it's actually kind of a humorous book, which is a little bit surprising to people. It's self-deprecating humor, it's ironic, but it kind of helps people handle the sadder moments of the book, because it's kind of like the character, I never take myself very seriously in the book, and I think that kind of might speak to people. Um,
Well, you are an excellent storyteller, to say the least. I was
oh,
sitting on
thank you.
the edge of my seat listening as you just shared so many different aspects of, well, all parts of your life. And I thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, we're all in this together. I think everyone suffers, even though you may not be aware of it at
Mm,
first, and that we do have each other. And when you open yourself to other people and think about what they're going through, it really can bring us together. I think we need that a lot right now.
absolutely. Perfectly said. And again, Jeff, I thank you for being on. Never ever give up hope.
It was my pleasure. It was a delight speaking with you, Carol. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.